All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So we're going to continue talking about Darwin and dive a little deeper today into the overarching principles of what natural selection is and the principles underlying how it works. These are really important that you understand this because it's also going to continue to come back again and again and again. So when we talk about natural selection, one of the things that is necessary in order for it to work is this idea of overproduction. What we're talking about here is that nature tends to overproduce offspring. I need this to be the case because there needs to ultimately be differential success in surviving to adulthood and reproducing. And this means competition has to happen. There needs to be a winner and a loser. Think about it this way. If I walked into a kindergarten classroom with a truckload of Oreo cookies, just dumped them in the middle of the room, and there were plenty to go around for all the kids to stuff their faces until they were puking. Everybody's going to have enough, right? But I go into that same classroom a week later with 12, right? Classroom of, say, 25 kids. And I take 12 Oreos and I stick them in the middle of the room. Somebody's coming out of there with a cookie, and somebody's coming out of there with nothing. That's the idea. There needs to be more individuals in the population than that ecosystem is capable of sustaining. That way, somebody was able to fight their way in and get that cookie based on their intelligence, based on their just brute strength, whatever the case might be. Somebody won based on the traits that they had. And somebody lost because they didn't quite have what it took. And that's the idea here. So there has to be competition for somebody to win and somebody to lose so that the more successful traits are present in the individuals who get the resources that they need. And as a result, that set of individuals are the ones who survive longer, reproduce more. It doesn't mean, however, that sort of a less capable individual never reproduces. It just may mean that the one individual makes 10 offspring as opposed to 8 compared to someone else, compared to 2 of someone else in the population. So hopefully that makes sense. And so there has to be limited resources, right? Those populations tend to stay stable overarchingly. If we look at this, go back to your ecology, right? This is a logistic growth curve. We're hitting that carrying capacity, meaning we're hitting those limiting resources. While I'm talking about this exponential growth here, there really is no natural selection. There's enough resources to go around that everybody is getting what they need and everybody is reproducing at the same rate, give or take. So there is no differential success in that reproduction. But by the time I hit carrying capacity of that population, now my resources are limited. And so now I'm really getting that competition that's going on. The individuals who are able to outcompete theoretically should be the individuals who are out reproducing others. And so those individuals and their traits are being passed on a little bit more often, generation after generation after generation. And there has to be variation within the population. Not only that, that variation has to be heritable. So the variation that we see in, say, the colors of our ladybugs here has to be genetically controlled, and then that variation has to mean something to their reproductive success, whether it's their ability to stay away from predators because they're camouflaged. And so they reproduce a little more often because they didn't get eaten yet. Or it's more attractive to a female, and so they have more reproductive events as a result, so on and so forth. So their survival and their reproduction is dependent on part on those inherited traits. Those that give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing have a higher fitness. That unequal ability to survive and reproduce is what gives us that gradual change over time. Those more favorable characteristics are in the individuals who survive and reproduce more, and so that's what accumulates over generations. And we see this in artificial selection. We do this on purpose. We've been doing it for thousands of years, and this was something else that Darwin was able to point to when we talk about breeding our domestic plants and animals. So if you look at the picture here, all right, we're talking about a wild mustard plant that existed by itself, and humans took it and bred it for certain traits. So individuals who wanted better leaves, they bred those over and over again and got kale. We looked at sort of these axillary buds, bred them together to get bigger and bigger buds, which is where we get the Brussels sprouts. And think about it from livestock, right? We do that with cows and pigs and sheep and all that kind of stuff for certain traits all the time. So when we look at natural selection, there's a couple of pieces that you really need to make sure you understand. It's differential success in reproduction. End of discussion. That has to be there in order for these traits to matter moving forward. And that also means that they have to be heritable traits. I have to be able to have that characteristic coded for my DNA to pass that DNA on to my offspring, for my offspring to then have that trait. That's where Lamarck failed, right? It's not an acquired trait. Natural selection in and of itself doesn't create new traits. It only can edit and select what's already there. So although we as humans might go, hey, that trait might have been really beneficial to have at this point in history, if it never existed or it died out in ancestral populations millions of years ago, there's no coming back. The local environment also determines which traits are selected for and against. If I move that individual into a different population in a different environment, those traits may or may not be beneficial to them anymore. So if that environment changes, hopefully that population has the set of variations still existing to then have the traits necessary to adapt again. A couple of pieces to watch, to be careful with. First and foremost, individuals never evolve. Once again, that's where Lamarck fails. It's populations, and remember we define a population as a group of individuals living in the same place at the same time of the same species. So when we measure evolution, we're measuring the changes of heritable variations in a population over many generations. Another piece. Natural selection can only amplify or diminish heritable traits. Once again, this is where Lamarck fails. Those organisms who acquire characteristics within their lifetime may be better suited to their environment during their lifetime, but at least at this point, we have no evidence to suggest that those acquired traits can be inherited. Could they potentially be taught? Maybe, and now that's opening a whole other can of worms. For our purposes, we're dealing with organisms, we're dealing with the traits that they can inherit. Environmental factors also vary from place to place and from time to time, and so those traits that may be favorable in one situation may be useless or even harmful if we change the conditions that they're found in.